Welcome to session 5. So the story continues. So let's dive right in. So in the previous session, we talked about how in Citibank Cash Management India, we got to 10 customers. We got the right team in place and we set the right growth culture. And now we are in the beginning of 1986. So before us, we now have a fair degree of clarity as to the tasks that we have to do. So one of the things that we realized when we talked to customers was that when they collected money, they got checks which were drawn on the metros where we had branches. So those were easy. We could send them in clearing and we could get the money and then we could transfer it. The second set of checks were those which were drawn on some of the important cities. And if you kind of took all of those, the important cities and the metros, more or less they accounted for 80% of the sales of the companies that we were targeting. Now, it's quite important also to realize who our target market was. So in this particular case, our target market, we had defined it very clearly as the top 300 companies by sales in India. Now, why was that? Because we were taking a risk by setting up credit lines for these customers while their checks were in clearing. And we'll talk in a later session in more detail about risk and risk management. But for now, we also had this understanding that if we covered these top cities somehow, where we didn't have a branch, then we could do much more in the metros, and that's what the customers wanted. And that was a big problem in actually closing a sale, because they were saying, oh, just for like 20% of our sales, we don't want to mess with our existing system. And remember, their existing system could be that they really banked with someone else, they did their cash management with someone else. So the change was not that easy. So the balance 20% of checks, or demand drafts as they were called at that time, were essentially drawn on very, very many different locations all over India, small places. So if we wanted to handle 100% of the collections of a company, then we had to find solutions for all three. So if you remember, the metro solution that we had, where we had branches, was called City Clear. We called the solution in the cities, the top tier cities other than the metros, City Speed, and we called the solution for other checks, we called it City Check. So we named these without actually having the products ready, so that we could start working towards launching the products. Now, to launch the products, one of the very important things, especially for City Check and also to some extent City Clear, we knew that we would need a technology solution. So in our head, we kind of drew out how this thing would work and so on and so forth, and started building the technology that we needed for the product. Now, this was before we had customers and we would have needed partners for City Speed, which in some ways was the most difficult product, because for City Check, which was the checks drawn on all over the country, we did have a solution which we used to do for customers, which was called check discounting, where we would take these checks and then we would mail them to the various banks that they were drawn on, and the banks would then mail us back checks. So a terribly inefficient process which would take 20, 30 days, but it was for a relatively small portion of the sales of the company, and there was nothing better. So we had that process. Now we could make that process really efficient so that we tracked every single check that went out. We made sure that we followed up to get the check things back, and so on and so forth. So, because if a check got lost or something like that, then as long as the company knew, then and they knew who had given them that check, they could go back to them, get a fresh check, or get some way that they could collect that money. So the information was very, very vital. So anyway, we started trying to design the software. Now, the interesting part about designing the software was that if we had relied on our in-house technology team, which, if you remember, I used to head before I took on this assignment, then I knew that it would take forever because there were many things that that team had to work on, and we would get into a big queue. And it was very difficult to do something innovative with our core system, because that was a system which served our branches around the globe, and trying to mess with it, we needed lots of approvals and things like that. So we had to come up with a clever solution, keeping these constraints in mind. So what we did was we treated our backend system, which we call the black box, as a black box. And we said, okay, we just have to feed information into this black box so that the accounting entries can be passed, the books balance, and so on and so forth. But other than that, we will keep all the functionality, the front-end functionality, on a separate software, which would just talk to the black box. Now, this is very common right now, but remember that we are talking about 1986. So at that time, these kind of solutions were not common at all. But we came up with that. And then the interesting part was, how do you select the vendor who would build this? Now we could, because we were Citibank, we were pretty big in India, we could go to the top technology firms in India at that point, and they would have been very, very happy to give us a solution. But our project cost was not all that big. We didn't want to make it all that big because we knew that it was a relatively easy piece of software to build. And the other point was that we didn't want to get lost in the queue in large technology companies. So there were many, many small technology companies which were trying to break through to get a large customer like Citibank. So we started talking to them, and we finally latched on to one of them who gave us a good quote. And here the quote was not in terms of price, because this is a very common mistake that a lot of people who are developing products that they think will be very, very good make, is that they try and go for the lowest cost person, instead of going to a person who can give them the quickest time to market and very good quality, and who's willing to accept a penalty clause. Because we realize that even if we paid double, we would recover that in terms of sales of our product if our product was a hit. So we ended up making the right vendor selection, working very closely with that vendor so that we were ready with the technology by the time our products were ready for launch. Because there are several other things besides technology that you need to do to be able to get your product ready for sale and have all your internal approvals in place. So again, a lot of people make the mistake of trying to do things sequentially, but we did everything in parallel. So if I remember right, we were ready with our full suite of products in 90 days, which was again kind of amazing given the complexity of these products and the partner relationships that we needed, as you will see in the next slide. So, what ended up happening with Citibank cash management was that though Citibank was a foreign bank in India, and though it only had 6 of its own branches just in 4 major cities, Citibank ended up partnering with various regional banks and starting with Dena Bank and built the largest pan-India network, which was for cash management, which was even bigger than the network of State Bank of India. Now, how we did that, and this will be the start of that story. So first of all, we kind of realized that how does this all make sense? So we realized that for a bank like Dena Bank, for them to go and approach one of the top 300 companies in the country, and for those 300 companies to do business with Dena Bank was kind of hard unless one of the companies was located in an area that Dena Bank served very well, and Dena Bank was strong in the west of India, mainly Gujarat. It was pretty hard for them to make a sale to these kind of things. So it made sense for them to partner with us. Now, one of the things that they wanted was that Citibank would open an account with them, and that while the checks were being cleared, there would be money lying in that account, and that account would be non-interest bearing, and it would have a very large amount of money in it because the number of items which would be in clearing would be quite large. So that was the main thing that they were interested in. So we kind of figured that, yes, this makes sense. Now, the other interesting part was that this money, which was in the account with Dena Bank, would qualify for statutory reserves that the bank needed to maintain. So the cost of maintaining that account at a zero balance was virtually zero for Citibank because it was part of the statutory reserves. So with all this in mind, now the question was, how do we manage to convince Dena Bank, which is a very slow moving bank, to actually do this business? And this was where the brilliance of Sajeev Sarpal, who was my product manager, who really helped a lot in terms of also getting the technology in place and getting everything else related with the product in place, getting the product manuals ready, which we'll talk about again later. So he figured out who was the correct person to talk to in Dena Bank, and then worked on him. And the basic thing was, we kind of convinced him that if this project was to go through, it would help his career a lot within Dena Bank, and that he would become a hero in Dena Bank, and that we would do all the work to make sure that the whole thing was successful. And that led us to get the Dena Bank team. Now, in parallel, 2 other people in my team, Vikram Sood and Sanjay Nair, were also hard at work, setting up the operations, setting up, getting customers, getting customer feedback, raising the profile. So by the time we were ready to launch these products and say, come to this sort of April, May of 1986, it was very clear, both internally with our customers, within our team, that we were on to something big. And we were in the process of recruiting people and building our team and so on. So we'll talk about that in the next session. Thank you very much for listening to me.